Okay, so welcome again everybody to this second webinar in this particular series. So I think most of you were at the previous one, the Great Luciferic Ahrimanic Face-off, and if not, that you had an opportunity to look at the video. So this particular series is taking some of the foundational work we did earlier in the year and deepening it, particularly in relation to specific themes that were, came up of interest. So really we're looking at the nature of duality and how it has changed, how it puts on a different face, so to speak, in different times. In different epochs. So last time we were looking at the motif of the Persian Germanic initiate from the sealing of the first cupola. And we'll be looking at the slides in a minute just to refresh your memories. And I had a little bit of a discussion around why it's called the Persian Germanic, why it looks back to the second post-Atlantean epoch. And it's very much because in the nature of dualism, as we experience today, has its roots in what was experienced by humanity back 4,000, 5,000, 6,000 years ago, in this experience, in this sort of what's often in the creation, that time when that is expressed as the separation between heaven and earth, night and day. So, but as a picture of the human being having that experience of there being both a being of light, Ahura Mazda, and a being of darkness, Ahriman. And we saw last time how this metamorphosed into this, what was more of an outer experience for the human being, bearing in mind that back then, the human being, we didn't have that sense of inner and outer the way that we have it today. That came later. That came with the ancient Greeks, that sense of having an inner self and an outer self. But nevertheless, what was experienced in the awakening of perception thousands of years ago is now something that resides in our soul life. And so we're going to look at today how, in fact, how we have this sense of what was the experience of Lucifer, the Luciferic and the Ahrimanic in our soul life as literally up against each other, which is why I called it the face-off. How this changes over time into the future as much as we can project. So of course it's always harder with something that's in the future to really look at how to really sort of discuss it. As I was saying in this lecture, I was giving an overview of the motifs last Tuesday night in Rudolf Steiner House in Sydney, is that all the motifs are a metamorphosis of each other, and we see the spiritual history of humanity is accompanied by Lucifer and Ahriman appearing in different ways and according to our consciousness. But before we get into the slides, want to actually do this webinar a little bit differently. Normally in the past, of course, I've gone straight into the slides. We've had looked straight at the motifs. We've done a drawing exercise, and then we've had some discussion. And last time, of course, we had a very interesting discussion. And I'm hoping that we can do that again. But what I'd actually like to do is I'd like to open it up a little bit to start with, before I go to the slides, as to what is the shadow? What do we mean by the shadow? How do we experience the shadow? And how does this relate to the double? Are they the one and the same thing? So for many people, I mean, the concept of having a shadow self is not, of course, particular or unique to anthroposophy and anthroposophists, Jung did a tremendous amount of work, and it's his understanding of our shadow self that is perhaps the one that's gone into the general consciousness of people today. But in fact, I mean, you find the shadow or the double or the doppelganger appearing in before that, often as a concept or as an idea, or particularly in stories, in stories and folk tales, things like that. And I remember that perhaps maybe not the first book that I read, that I read that talked about, that gave this picture of a human being having a shadow self, was this book by the Scottish writer George MacDonald, who wrote a book called Fantasies, which is an adult fantasy book. And the book was in fact published in 1858, 100 years before I was born. And he was kind of a forerunner of fantasy writers. He was very influential on Lewis Carroll and C.S. Lewis. And he's also well known for his children's fairy tales, but he was also, I should say, he was a Christian minister as well as a writer. And in this book, Fantasies, there's a young man called Anados, and right about his 21st birthday, he has this, you might say, a crossing threshold experience. He's given a gift, which he's allowed to, or he's taken into fairyland. He wakes up one morning and finds in his bedroom there is turning into a meadow, even as, he's got a spread carpet which becomes a meadow, and a little river starts to run between it, down through it, and the leaves on his curtain turn into the leaves of a tree, and he finds himself crossing over the river, which is always a significant moment in fairy tales and myths and legends, crossing over a river and going into fairyland. And of course, I'm not going to go into the whole story, but his experience in going through fairyland, bearing in mind that he's just turned 21, just become an adult, is that he meets wonderful people, and of course fairyland has this golden glow about it, and there's also evil people, there's evil spirits of trees, but at one point he's having, you might say, he's walking in wonder and openness at what he is meeting in fairyland. And then he has an experience where he comes to this building, which is something like a church called the Church of Darkness, and there's a strange woman in there, and he goes in and she's reading from a book, and he goes into the room and she says, "Don't open that door," and he opens that door, and hurtling towards him comes this dark figure, and this figure is his shadow, and this shadow attaches itself to him, and it's not his ordinary shadow. It's got no matter where the sun is or where the light is, the shadow lies always beside him or in front of him, and it takes on grotesque shapes. And as he goes on into fairyland, he finds that every time he meets someone, like he meets a young girl, he walks into a village and he first meets a young girl, and he sees her with his fairyland eyes, and then the shadow rears up in between her and him, and all of a sudden it's like he suddenly sees, oh, I didn't really see her before. She's just an ordinary, coarse little peasant girl, with just this village isn't such a pretty fairyland village after all. It's just an ordinary village, and with ordinary, coarse peasants. And he finds that this increasing sort of cynicism of everything he looks, and the wonder that he had beforehand has been overtaken by this sense of, oh, I won't be taken in again by that. I'm now too clever to see that this was all illusion before. But he also becomes aware as he goes on that through his journey that he desperately wants to get rid of this shadow. He's very aware of it, but he wants to get rid of it. And he only eventually gets rid of his shadow, which accompanies him through all kinds of journeys and all kinds of extraordinary experiences, in the end, it's only by a deed of sacrificing his life for someone else, for someone, a knight and a maiden who he thinks are a better people than himself. And when he goes through kind of a death process, and then he realizes as he wakes up, he no longer has his shadow. His shadow has now disappeared. So it's a very beautiful fairy tale, but of course, it's not it's a kind of a particular picture of an experience, we might say, of the ego entering adulthood and having the kinds of experiences that adults have. But I was always struck by that picture of this action of the shadow, which destroyed any illusions and made him feel more clever, and yet undermined his joy of living. And so, just wondering if anybody else would like to share how any stories or fairy tales where they might have read about someone who was carrying their shadow or met their double. Anybody got any examples I could share?
Well, there's the Oscar Wilde picture, the picture of Dorian Gray. So that's a classic.
Yep.
Where it's a bit Faustian, and he, makes a pact with the devil, and then he stays young and lovely and wonderful. And there's this picture in the attic that gets all his, and eventually when he goes up and has a look at it, I mean, he's totally horrified, and there's this, really horrible being. So that's a more modern one.
Yeah, about 50 years.
Yeah.
Yeah. Thanks, Jessie. Anyone else? None of you have ever come across the double or the shadow in literature?
Fiona, so you're saying the shadow and the double are similar? They're the same thing?
Well, let's leave that open for the moment.
Because certainly when someone is dying, you often experience what I would call the double.
Yeah.
Through the moods of a person. It's like there's kind of it's a struggle, you could say, a battle with the double or the shadow side, and it can often come out in moods as the person is sort of starting their journey to cross the threshold, and it's like they have to divest themselves of it before they go. That's the experiences I would have when I'm working with people. Yeah.
But you haven't come across it in literature?
Not in literature directly, not that I can think of. Probably have, but I can't think of it offhand.
Dostoevsky,
yeah.
Wrote about the double.
I'd like to say something, yes. I'm thinking of Dr. Jekyll. What is it? Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde.
Yeah. Yeah?
Dr. Jekyll, isn't it? Yeah. Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. It's almost popular culture now. That's kind of someone facing their double, but not really being conscious of it. So they wake up in the morning and they're not actually, they only experience the evidence of what they've done, but they don't really, they're not really conscious of what they're doing. I think that's what the double, the shadow, maybe the shadow shadow is a bit more conscious of but could be a bit more conscious, but yeah, that's always been an interesting story for me.
Yeah. So
it's a question of whether you're conscious of your double or not.
yeah, and this is kind of the crux of the matter, isn't it? It's this whether one is aware. Now, the fairy tale I told, the story that I was talking about, the fantasies, he was immediately aware, which is unusual compared to some of the other stories, though I have read in other ones that where someone's quite aware that through some act of pride or arrogance or something that there's a dark being starts to follow them. They feel shadowed and dogged by a dark being. None of you have read the Steiner's mystery dramas?
Yes.
Well, we come across Johannes's double in The Soul's Probation, for instance. And his double says to him, "I must not ever leave you. You will often find me by your side." And I have the fuller quote about it that we're going to look at a little bit later. But I must not ever leave you. I shall not ever leave you. I will not. I am compelled to be with you. And you'll often find me by your side. And so it's really, it is something that, I mean, Rudolf Steiner talks about the double. He talks about the double as something that when we're born, an Ahrimanic double who is like a Mephistopheles figure, Ahrimanic double joins with us just in this kind of moment between incarnation and birth, and that's the one that Irmhild was referring to, that then leaves us just before we die, because the double, this Ahrimanic being, this Ahrimanic spirit that attaches itself to us, cannot bear death. It can't comprehend death. And that's what happened to Anados in that fairy tale, is that by going through death, and it's, well, an act of selfless sacrifice and then death overcame his shadow. So we have Rudolf Steiner talking about the double in relation to this second self, usually unconscious, that we carry with us through our earthly existence. But he also then in other places, so specifically in relation to the Goetheanum, the motifs that we're going to look at, but also in other places where he talks about how everything has a shadow. Not just people have a shadow, but everything has its shadow, has a shadow. And this is actually something of a Manichaean idea, that where you light a candle, there's always you cast a shadow. And he talks about, in one of the references that I gave you, he talks about how everything that comes down to us from Solomon's temple, there's a shadow of that we've been left with, and same with Hellenism, and same with the Roman Empire. So the sense of whatever there is, not just human beings, also throws a shadow, and this shadow aspect. That's a good question, Susan. Susan's asked, does the Luciferic being birth with the humans? Well, not in the current time, as I understand it.
You just mentioned several times the Ahrimanic being birthing with, or whatever, coming at birth and then leaving at death. I just wondered, what's Lucifer doing amongst that?
Well, but at the moment we're talking about it this time. So in this epoch, in this era. So in the previous stage, in the earlier times, in the time of, for instance, of the intellectual mind, what Steiner calls the intellectual mind soul, this was knowledge, or this was not so. Yeah, and to digress, we actually have a sense of something of this when we look at the story of Parsifal, which we know is was dear to Rudolf Steiner's heart, particularly the Eschenbach version, but not only the Eschenbach version, but where he talks about how everybody in that story, other than Parsifal, is whole in themselves, whereas Parsifal is the first modern human being because he experiences himself as a split self, as split, as his inner and his outer self, as being not in harmony with each other. And for this reason, unlike all the others, he has a different path and suffers in a different way. So this sense of everything having its shadow, Rudolf Steiner talks about, but this what it actually means, or what he's saying that this is that the shadow is that which is often what we in ourselves that we don't recognize, but in whole, streams of inspiration or movements like Hellenism or in a religion, or one could say also in anthroposophy as well. It's not excluded that you could say that anthroposophy casts a shadow when it is taken as being a fixed truth. When something is taken in its absolute sense and is unable to metamorphose and transform along with human evolution. That is to say, it's those bits that you might say, in fact, it's when something then becomes out of time. So the Manichaean, just to go back to the Manichaean picture, the Manichaean picture is that there's no such thing as an absolute evil. Evil is good out of its true time, something that was a light, you might say, was a truth and was good for a time, but 100, 200, 1,000 years later, if one's still hanging on to that old form, then it becomes you start to deal with its shadow of it, and it's no longer. It can become a force of destruction, a force of evil. So there's something of that, and I have a couple of quotes coming up in the slides that may shed a little bit more light on that. So, and we also saw in the last webinar, we'll see this picture again, that in that motif of the Persian Germanic human being with the figures of Lucifer and Ahriman directly above, literally down, one on either side, splitting the human being in half. As we also saw that Ahriman was pictured there with his shadow. There are two Ahrimanic heads there, and we'll be looking at that image. So, has anybody got anything else they'd like to share out of their own study or experience before we go to the slides? So here, of course, we have our image of the Slavic initiate and the Slavic epoch. And we're looking at it particularly as a development of the dualism, which you looked at in detail, in more depth last time. So let's just look at, we've got three different motifs here, but of course on the ceiling of this small cupola and the first Goetheanum, they didn't have a demarcation line between them at all. In fact, they were hardly separate from each other. We see here the Slavic human being of the 6th epoch, running into the 5th with the Germanic Persian initiate. And I put a little black line there because further around the wall was our Faust image. So we've got, in fact, Faust is the Faust motif brought us into the 5th, into our modern epoch. And this is in this fifth epoch just here. This motif is, we're still in the very early stages of that. We've still got another about 2,000 years to go at the moment. And then, of course, we have our 6th. And if you're wondering why I've gone 6th, 5th, and early 5th, it's because we have to remember that on the ceiling of the small cupola, all these motifs, except the representative of humanity, appeared twice. So this is actually the right-hand side as we were looking in. And for those who are interested in this, these weren't up against, they weren't side by side. We actually had the Greek and the Egyptian initiates in this, in between Faust and the modern human being with the Germanic initiate. And that in itself is something for us to remind us that our spiritual evolution is not linear. Yeah, we don't have to think of things as always being lined up, and that we, you know, we've left one epoch behind and we're now right in this one. We have to, as the ceiling motifs, both large and small cupolas demonstrate, there's this flowing over into each other, and especially in our soul life, there is this interpenetration of surfaces and beings and spiritual development and soul states. And I bring in the Faust motif just so that we can quickly reiterate that here we have Faust as our human being in this, and his the only writing that was, you know, in the first Goetheanum, this I, which is on that's supposed to be a book, and that's kind of a picture of how printing put the word into a coffin or fixed it. So there's a certain kind of fixedness there. And we have above him our angelic being and the skeleton of picture of death down below, and we have the child figure reaching towards Faust. And we see these elements transformed as we come into the 5th epoch and then into the 6th. So the being that is hovering over the head of Faust becomes, you might say, metamorphoses into the Luciferic being here, and the death motif metamorphoses into the Ahrimanic being, now in our soul, face to face with Lucifer here. And the child, who is, you might say, sometimes called our spirit self, or the youthful forces, even of, one might say, the youthful forces that all children, hopefully still, bring with them when they're born into the world. It's that openness to what's coming, to the light or to our higher self. We see with the Germanic motif, we see that the human being is now holding the child in his palm of his hand. And last time we were talking about how we could only bear this experience of our soul being torn one way or the other between the two extremes of the Luciferic and the Ahrimanic, by having this child-like force for us to help carry us. And then when we go to the 6th epoch, into the future, we see that this dualism of the Lucifer and Ahriman have now actually become so integrated into the human being. So imagine this was our experience of usually unconscious in our soul life, becomes the experience of having a second self that we actually, Rudolf Steiner says we will actually experience this second self, as it said in that in the soul's probation, someone standing by our side. And we also then have the these two inspiring beings, and I should just mention, I forgot to mention, must remember that the inspiring being for Faust was actually the figure of death. The inspiring figure for the Germanic human being is the child, and the inspiring figures for the future human being in the next epoch is both these figures, who have in fact are a metamorphosis of the Luciferic into the blue angel and the Ahrimanic into the Ahrimanic center. But Rudolf Steiner says that they no longer, they're much less connected with the human being now, our inspirer. They are much more connected with cosmic forces. So in a way, we actually see more of a distinction here between the earthly, the human being going through their earthly life, now with this a much stronger sense of having a second self or accompanied by a shadow, and our inspires being less connected, less bound by the earth, and much more cosmically connected. So we see then this metamorphosis of these different influences and how they take form and experience in different times through our evolution. And just to reiterate what again about that sense of in our modern day, today, in our modern state, we actually experience that one half of us is Luciferic. They're actually in us, both of them present there, working together. As it says that we shouldn't ever think of them as being separate, because then we don't understand them in that way. They are not separate. They constantly work together, and it's, as it says, whatever one accomplishes, the other makes use of, and vice versa. And then we must see that they are actually in this living relationship. And as I said last time, that when we did the sketch, we actually created the face of Lucifer out of the negative of the Ahrimanic being, so that one is the counter or the negative of the other. And there is Ahriman, and there's his shadow. Yeah, so just to put that quote in there to say that we have to actually make a picture of this in our mind, that on the left, I know it's on the right here, but you have to, that's, let's not get fixed on that, because on the other side of the cupola, Lucifer's on the left. But the left side of the human being is Luciferic, so to speak, and on the right, Ahriman is in this perpetual face-off, and yet grappling and working together. So our left human being is Luciferic, and our right human being is Ahrimanic. And our whole, as we talked about last time, the whole art of life consists of finding the true balance between. So the Slavic motif can be seen then as a picture of the development of this dualistic principle, when, as it says here in this excerpt from this lecture, dualism is so evolved that a human being will actually sense themselves as having a double nature, of actually having his shadow, what says here, within himself, but also beside himself. It is actually pictured, sense, and he, in that lecture, Rudolf Steiner talks about how today already in the Russian people, the Russian person already has a sense of having a shadow self there, a shadow beside him or her. So what for us, this dualistic principle of Lucifer and Ahriman that we're constantly pushed and pulled between and trying to constantly walk this tightrope or find this balance between the two through steadfastness, through our moral development, through the Christ being. We talked about all these different ways of how we actually find that balance. This dualism is going to undergo a metamorphosis as we move into the future and into the far future. In 2,500 to 3,000 years, it will actually be so evolved that it will become, the split self will become even more split to be a split human being. Quite extraordinary, really, when you think about it. Another way that this motif is also pictured, and this was in the pastel sketch that was done before they actually painted, is that the Slavic motif is also a picture of light and darkness. And as it says here in this quote, we must learn to distinguish the shadows from the light. And this goes back to this what Stein was saying about everything. Everyone and everything casts a shadow. And that will be humanity's task from the present time into the immediate future to really be able to recognise what are the shadows and what is the light. And we can see this. I'm sure we can all think of many examples in our modern day life where we're torn between wondering what is right and what is wrong, what is true and what is not, what's misinformation and what's true knowledge. And this is our task, to learn to distinguish these. And out of this, to do this, we have to know ourselves, of course. It's know thou thyself, the admonition. Know yourself. Recognize those parts of you which you do not want to recognize. Listen to your soul. And it says, because the shadows will and are asserting themselves. And particularly it says, I noticed this bit, they will become effective through people who have perhaps endured little themselves of great suffering, who have no sympathy, no empathy for the troubles and the sufferings of others. And I can kind of immediately think of the rationalistic kind of approach. Oh yes, well, we often find in politicians who perhaps suffer very little and yet are in charge of the services that are there to carry, to address the sufferings of people, and yet so often these services are cut because the money could be used somewhere else, they say. Yeah. So, and yet it's not, we can't just say, of course, this is just other people. We also have to look at it, how it is in ourselves. Everything is right in its own time, but if it's taken in its absolute sense and carried on after it's become antiquated, it becomes a shadow. So what might think was the truth or the light, in fact, can suddenly realise that in fact it's a false light. And so we're in a very difficult, an extremely challenging time for which it seems that is going to become more of the same, and yet in a different way. And this other aspect to the double or the shadow is also another way of looking at it is through this when I was talking about earlier about the Ahrimanic spirit who becomes our double and follows us through our life until usually about 3 days before we die. Often this is that voice that says to us that there is no spiritual world. You know, there's only the material world, that and that it's kind of someone who whispers to us about, you know, is this again a bit like Anados and his shadow, where the shadow took away his wonder and openness and made him more clever, and whispered to him and kind of was there saying, no, it's not all beautiful and true, you know, there we are, this is, now I'm showing you how it really is. This is also a kind of a way how Steiner also pictures how this shadow or this double works. And here we see, yeah, I'll just go on to the next slide, just to go to that quote from Johannes and his double in the soul's probation, scene 5, if you want to look it up. I've got 2 different translations here. So one, I must not ever leave you. You will in future often find me at your side. Here we are, the shadow at his side. I shall not go from you until you find the power of that which you are to become. And the other translation sheds a little bit more light on this. I leave thee not until thou hast found the power that makes me the very counterpart of that pure being which thou shalt become. And yet you have not yet reached this high state. You're still deluded by your personal self, and you think that you've already attained this higher state. So I shall not go from you until you find that power to be the pure being that you could and should become. And I find it very interesting the way in the original sketch, the 2 human beings, one is in the peach blossom, the etheric, the colour of the etheric, and the other is the counter colour of black. And some of you, of course, did the series on painting the colours, image and lustre, and we looked at in detail, in some depth, and worked with peach blossom and black. So it's interesting how these 2 colours have been used. And in a lot of the pictures that I've seen where artists have worked with them since, for instance, Gerhard Wagner, he when he paints this motif, he keeps that light and darkness quality in the human being with their shadow self, the two selves. So the overcoming of the shadow, our shadow, is the recognition, but also this admonition and warning that to Johannes, which we could all take on board, is that we have not, Johannes, you have not yet reached this higher state for all the spiritual development you think you have. Don't be. You are deluded by your personal self and think that you have attained something. It's like an admonition that we may think that we're well along the path to spiritual development, and we may begin to think that we are attaining something of our higher self, and yet we can be so easily deluded by our personal self, by being driven by our lower or our personal self, our personality, our shadow, our double. And this gets in the way of thinking, just like Anna does with his clever self, that we've actually attained something. So there's just the two versions. So this was the pastel sketch showing the human being, or the Slavic initiate, which of course we're all initiates now, so we can say the Slavic human being as a light, as pictured as in light and darkness, or life and death, because peach blossom is, in peach blossom we experience the life of the etheric. It is the colour of the etheric, and in black we experience the image. It's the image of death, of the lifeless. It's a spiritual image. It's a spiritual image, but of death, or of the lifeless. Whereas on the right we see how it was a photo of this, or how it was actually painted by one of the painters, not by Rudolf Steiner, as not being quite so differentiated between the two. So certainly not painted differently out of the colour, but a more clearly a picture of, this is not just like a soul state, but this is also the full human being, side by side as we will experience ourselves. So has anybody got any thoughts or comments before we do some practical work working with this sketch? Anything thoughts that have come up, or anything you'd like to share?
Well, Fiona, you know, earlier when you were talking about know yourself and everything, and right at the start of the mystery dramas, I think it's Strada actually, and he goes into this elemental world where everything sort of becomes living, and he hears the rocks and the thunder and everything speaking to him, and they're speaking and saying, "Oh man, know yourself." And then he sort of sees scenes where you know, he's now seeing maybe things that things in his life that were where he caused hurt or harm to other people, and at the end of it he says, "Oh, you know, who are you, pernicious monster?" And then he says, "Oh, it is I, pernicious monster." And he sort of, when I saw this at the Goetheanum a few years ago, and then he actually just sort of falls to the floor and he's, you know, prostrate. He's just totally overcome by this confrontation. And I just think it's interesting that all these the whole elemental world also just became really alive for him at that point. Yeah.
Yeah, that's the same in the George MacDonald story. He's actually experiencing the elemental world. He's all the, you know, the gnomes and the water beings and the tree beings. He's having that fairyland is in fact the world of the etheric, of the yeah. Thanks, Jessie. And know yourself. It's in that yeah. So which one was that in again?
Well, that's right at the start in the first one. I think it's scene 2.
The portal of initiation.
Yeah, portal. Yeah. Neil did it when we did it.
Oh, right. Okay.
Very dramatically, I might say.
Yeah. Anyone else got anything to share, or any thoughts or puzzles?
Yes, I think it's a process of leaving our personality behind as we develop morally, and as we develop our self, our higher self, our spirit self. That's what's going to be left behind, but it's still a thing. It's not something that's just going to disappear. I think in the future it has to be dealt with in some way, but that motif for me just describes that leaving the personality behind and developing further. And the two figures there holding the rose cross, and it's sort of it gives you a sense of time, doesn't it? A sense of movement. The personality is all the accumulated karma that we have to come to terms with, how we have to face. And I guess that shock of facing it is something we're all going to have to go through. And it's a long process. It's not just once, is it? Because it's just, if we're living and we just make one mistake and then all of a sudden, oops, and then so, tomorrow we got to go through it again, and then the next day. So it's a constant initiation. Life is a constant initiation.
Yeah.
So that was sort of the living, that's where the living etheric element comes in. We're not fixed. We can't be fixed. So if we get fixed ideas about something, then we're not living in that flow. We're not living in that evolutionary path. In Orthodox Christianity, I think they call it the royal path. The royal path of not going in the extreme, of staying on the middle path.
Okay.
And I did want to say, in icons, we never paint shadows. There are no shadows in icons.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah.
There's no perspective and no shadows. Yeah.
Thanks, Svetlana. Diane, you'll need to unmute yourself.
Yeah, hi everyone. I'm really interested in the aspect we glanced over Jungian psychology, and my experience with that has been very powerfung in terms of looking at the shadow and working with it, and the stumbles and the falls and the models that Jung gave. I think it's a very it's sort of bringing the unconscious into the conscious and so on and so forth. It just seems like a really practical and useful and living creative gift that sort of somehow addresses this in a way. I think if people are struggling to deal with the shadow and the aspects where you stumble and fall, it seems quite pertinent, and it's been useful for me anyway. Jungian psychology, I think it's great. Yeah, that's it.
Thanks, Diane. I know you've all got lots of thoughts going on in your head.
All right, I'll take a risk.
All right, thanks, Linda.
I don't know. This is too personal. Not sure what the parameters of this discussion are. I missed the first one. I was traveling. I had a recent experience where a story that I watch my own stories. I just keep an eye on them, and I just say it's a story. Be prepared to look at it differently. Don't assume it's the story. And I had this sense of this story in my life to do with, I won't get too personal, but to do with relationships and this pattern that seemed to be there. And in the pattern, I seemed to be in this role, a particular role in each of these situations. And then about 2 weeks ago, it was like something woke up in me and suddenly said, just reverse it. So I appear to be the one who's doing this, and the others appear to be doing this. And then I was able to reverse it. Something in me just woke up and said, reverse it. Something in you must want them to do this because you keep choosing people in your life who do this. So it's 1 minute I'm thinking I'm like this and they're like that. And then I had to, so I guess the question in me, I've been trying to wake up to myself forever, 70, and suddenly out of, it seemed like the blue, I just saw the reversal of the picture that, and it wasn't, I haven't called it victim, persecutor or anything like that
for a long, 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 long time. It's not like I was typecasting myself as this poor victim of people who do this. It was just this dynamic, and suddenly it's like I just watched it reverse itself, and I suddenly saw myself as the one inviting that into my life, even though it seemed to be, oh, I keep inviting, this keeps happening in my life. I suddenly went, oh, I'm inviting that into my life. Might seem really obvious, but and it was a wonderful moment, and I could almost feel like a cellular change taking place in me. It was almost visceral, sort of something that woke up in all my cells that reversed the picture. So I don't know if that's related to a sense of the opposite, the other aspect of myself. I won't assume that, but and then the question is why that day, what happened that day that I was able to see what now seems so glaringly obvious, but that I hadn't seen for so long.
Yeah, I mean, it's the kind of the recurring. There's a sort of a bit of a theme of the need for a shock, or there is a kind of a confrontation required in order to see this.
Yeah.
And the other thing, of course, is that I think the shock for me, I mean, we're talking about, we talk about, working with our double now and meeting our shadow self. I think the shock for me is to have it revealed to us that we're going to still be doing the same thing in 3,000 years. This is not something that can be overcome by counselling sessions, in this life. This is something so deeply embedded in the human soul and in our spiritual development. It's so intrinsic to a deeper struggle that we have, that takes different forms. As I said, at the moment, according to Rudolf Steiner, it's a struggle between the Luciferic and the Ahrimanic, this dualistic feeling of being both a higher and a lower being, being torn between losing ourselves to the world or losing ourselves from the world, as we talked about last time. This constant sense of, is that my double coming up? Am I speaking out of my double? Is that what's come between in an encounter with somebody else? Is that what's jumped up in front of us? And yet, to these motifs, which are put up there as a picture of our, for us to study and ponder and contemplate upon, this is something, our future as well, and that it is going to continue as something deep in the soul life, which is going to continue into the far future, which we need to learn, we will be grappling with and working with. And yet, it's not just only going to be it's not just a burden. According to what is said in the soul's probation, this is actually what is going to help us become the purer, higher being we could and should become. Yeah? It's a necessary part. It's necessary for us to actually undergo this. If no one has anything else to share at this point, shall we actually do some drawing? We're going to actually bring this into a so I did send out an email about an hour beforehand, before we started, just to get some colours going, get some ready. So I'm going to switch cameras, and you get yourselves ready. There we are. So usually I do a short, as you know, I do a short picture imagination to take us into it. What I'm going to do, so what we're actually going to do, we're not going to do the whole motif. Well, we are in a way, but we're mainly going to focus on ourselves and our shadow picture. And the blue and the orange being are just going to be kind of in the far distance, high above us as a little inspirers. But let's just, instead of our picture imagination, I'm just going to read out that verse from the Soul's Probation, so that to really take us into this drawing of the Slavic human being, or as we will be in the far future, with our shadow self standing beside us, practically hand in hand. I have no power to go away from thee. Often you will find me standing by your side, and I will not leave you until you have found the power which makes me the very counterpart of that pure being which you shall become. I'll say it again, the other translation. I must not ever leave you. You will in future often find me at your side, and I shall not go from you until you find the power of that which you are to become. So we're going to create our peach blossom, our self out of the peach blossom colour, and our shadow self out of the browny black. And so, of course, some of you already know that we'll already be experienced with creating a peach blossom colour. So what we want is something not literally apricot coloured, but something that has a little bit of a kind of a fluctuating red quality. Now, of course, to do this with pastel, I'll show you the colours that I'm going to use. So I've got that colour, which is a kind of a pinky, and that colour. And I'm going to use a little bit of white over the top to give it a bit of light, fluctuating light in it. And I hope you can hear me okay, because we've got absolutely torrential rain here at the moment. I can hardly hear myself.
Very clear with me.
Good, good. Thanks, Linda. So we're going to do them quite large, our figures. So if you just start off, we're just going to do the outline of, or not the outline, but a kind of a silhouette, first of all, of ourselves, our etheric selves. Yeah, don't have to worry about it being particularly artistic.
Sorry, Fiona, what colour is that you're using?
It's this sort of,
oh yeah,
yeah,
okay.
pale pinky.
Yep.
Yeah. I mean, I always use a couple of colours with pastels to try and get the peach, or with anything actually, to try and get the peach blossom. You can't really, as I said, it's really the colour of the life force of the etheric, and so we really are only just can attempt it here, something that approximates it. I've done mine a little bit small. So. And then I'm going to bring some white over the top to both enliven the pastel pinky colour a bit, but also to give a hint of this sense of the life in the etheric body, in our life forces. You can, in fact, allow it to stream a little bit. I don't know if that's so obvious in this light. And then I'm going to take black and draw my shadow self. Or maybe I'll start in brown, actually. Really right beside, shoulder by shoulder, the same figure, or as close as possible. And then bring some black over the top. Now I'm taking a little bit of black around my figure as well, and you can do this by just using the black on your finger. So you don't need to actually draw it with the pastel, but you just like give it the shadow, a black halo. It's quite a powerful image. I know I'm looking at how mine looks on the screen. The moment my shadow is much more dominant than my true self, or my higher self, or my pure self, or that which I hope to become. So I'm going to go back and strengthen myself with a little bit stronger colour. And also going to put out one arm, one hand for the Rosicrucian cross. Before I add the Rosicrucian cross, I'm going to bring a little bit of gold around myself, as a counter to the black, something of that black halo around my shadows. And although it's not in the sketch, or in Rillestein's sketch, nevertheless, we have to remember in the two previous motifs, we did see the child figure, the inspiring child, the child figure, who is there, as you might say, our hope for the future. That we can bring in that sense of having something of that light around that potential, as a kind of a picture of the potential of what we should and could become when we really understand and recognize our shadow self. So we have our two figures, our true self, the forces, the etheric forces streaming around us, and a slight golden light around us, and then we have our shadow self, our dark blackish brown shadow self with something of that blackish forces or halo around us, standing there as a counter image of each other, side by side, as a picture of how we will experience ourselves even more. The double that we may experience or be aware of today will become a much stronger experience quite a long time into our future. So I'm going to add the rose cross now and a couple of the other elements of the sketch. You can just take the blue and our it's actually 7 stars, not 7 roses, but we can use red. And we could bring a little bit of gold around loosely, but high up above, high above us, we can now bring in the metamorphosed Ahrimanic spirit and the metamorphosed Luciferic in that blue angel and that orange centaur. So we're going to do it in bring those in a similar way to did it in the last, well, in previous times, is not so much not drawing a figure as I have done here, but really just out of the movement. Of that blue angel. In those rounded, swirling, dynamic, flowing movements that we also had when doing the Luciferic figure last time. And for the Ahrimanic centaur figure, something much more pointed. Strange little figure of the like this orange Ahrimanic centaur figure. Can give them a little bit of a face, the angel, if you want to, but you don't have to, just out of a sense of colour. Steiner was very particular about that. Everything was, all the figures arose out of the colour dynamic and the way the colours work, not vice versa. That's my quick sketch. So just the main thing is to have that sense of the double of our shadow, ourselves and our shadow, as counter image to each other. So that brings us to the end of this webinar. Hope that's given you some food for thought, some things to ponder. If you haven't had a chance to do any of the readings so far, then it's probably worth going back and having a look at some of those readings which I sent out. I just want to bring up the last slide. So the final webinar in a month's time, it's the last Saturday in November, is looking at how this, you might say it's not necessarily the next stage of development, but looking at the ERO as a picture. We have the Ahrimanic and the Luciferic, both in this threefold motif, but once again in a kind of pictured in a different way, as not so much working directly as a picture of our individual soul, but we're going to look at this image in the context of the foundation stone meditation, of course, which that 26th of November is the day before the beginning of Advent, the first Sunday in Advent, taking us into Christmas. Okay, so there we are. The video, of course, will be available in a few days' time. And hope to see you next time, in a month's time, as we wrap up this series for the year with the ERO motif and the foundation stone meditation.
Thank you, Fiona.
Okay then. Good night.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank
very
you.
much.
Bye-bye. Bye, everyone.
Thank you. Bye, Fiona and everyone.
Bye.
Thank you very much.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye.